All right. Can I speak without the mic? Can you guys hear me at the back all right?
Yeah.
This just cramps my style a little bit. So a very good evening and warm welcome to our first event of 2014. My name's Karan Anand and I'm going to be your MC for tonight's proceedings. It promises to be a really invigorating and thought-provoking event. And just on that point, it's actually quite appropriate that we're holding it in this venue. This room's called The Source, as you would have seen at the front, and it's actually the facility that Deloitte Australia uses to host all their innovation meetings and conferences. So it ties in really nicely with the topic of tonight's discussion. Just quickly, I want to deal with some housekeeping if I can. And let me know if you can't hear me at the back, I'll speak up a bit more. If you haven't already registered, I know we were running a little bit late with that. Please make sure you do before you leave, because we'd love to get your contact details so we can bombard you on email and Facebook. The bathrooms are located out the right in the back corridor down the end. If you haven't had a chance to eat some food, I think there's some left after the formalities, and we'd love it if you could stick around. Of course, we are a networking organization, and we'd love it if you left tonight, obviously having learnt something, but having made some new contacts and expanded your network a little bit. But of course, the real highlight of tonight's conversation is our panel discussion with our two very eminent panelists seated at the front here, which will be moderated by our very own Gurvanch Bhatia. But before we get into that, I thought I'd share a few thoughts on the significance of tonight's discussion and why it's particularly relevant for those of us gathered in this room tonight, particularly at this time. So for all of you that don't know, YSPN has been around for about a year and a half and was born out of a real desire to change, or actually to create a new conversation within our community. And it's this idea of the conversation that I want to really draw your attention to. So let's pause for a moment and explore what we mean by the term the conversation. And why it's not just important for us to change the conversation, but if you think about it, as I'll go on to speak, it's actually a social and intellectual imperative for us to create a new conversation. So if we think at the most abstract level, the fundamental thing that separates us from our animal brethren is our capacity for logical reasoning and communication, apart from our opposable thumbs. Now that's something that applies to all of humanity, and it's something that forms the basis for intellectual conversation, but it's not something that really makes it relevant for those of us gathered in this room tonight. What starts to make it relevant is the aspect that differentiates us, and that is that we're young professionals and we're Sikhs. So on the one hand, we have an identity, both spiritual and physical, extraordinarily rich in its tapestry and history, and a derivative of the greatest conversation that we'll ever know, of course contained within the Guru Granth Sahib. On the other hand, we're young professionals. We're educated, we're hardworking, and we're intellectual. So that could give the people gathered within this room enough of an idea on where the conversation could go, but it doesn't really give us enough of an idea of where we should be taking it at this time. For us to understand that, there are a couple of very fundamental propositions that we must address. And the first one, if you've been around this organization since the start, you would have heard us continuously reinforce for as long as we've been around, and it's something that we will continue to reinforce, and that is that we are the first generation of Australian educated young professional Sikhs, and it's a responsibility that we must never take lightly. The second is a derivative of the first one, and one which is most basic. If we're going to accept this responsibility, then we must act. And if action is the application of intellect, as it is in this case, then conversation is the tool that links the two. So if we then assert that facilitating an intellectual conversation is an imperative, then what is it that we should be talking about, and what have we, YSPN, been espousing in terms of conversation since we've been around? Well, the simplest way to think about the latter is to consider the flow of events that we've had since we've been an organization. And our focus in 2013 was to take you through an exploration of yourself, both as an individual and a professional. And we did this, if you remember, by showcasing the stories of eminent individuals and providing an environment where you could learn from both their triumphs and failures. So right at the start, we had an event where we had Sav Girin, the CIO of the Reserve Bank, and possibly the most eminent professional we have in our local community, who shared with us his personal journey. We then moved on to the very remarkable stories of Guillaume Swiggers, the CEO of Deloitte Australia, whose facility we're using tonight, and Dr. Parminder Sachdev, Order of Australia medalist and neuroscientist, who spoke to us about the value of networks, the value of hard work, and the value of perseverance. And those last two virtues completely shone through in our next event, where we held a lunch with the great Forjar Singh, the legendary 101-year-old marathon runner. It is absolutely impossible to not be inspired by his story. But we didn't stop there. We switched to the more practical, how do I create and manage my personal brand, with Chris Brown, the CEO of DDB Australia, one of the largest advertising houses in the country. And then we held what was possibly our most important event of our first year, where we celebrated the success of women within our community, trying in our very little way to fulfill that basic tenet of Guru Nanak's creed, that we are all created equal, and this is something that we must always cherish and celebrate. Now, I'm not sharing these with you to try and toot our own horn or try to elicit some sort of praise for the organization. I'm merely trying to show you that we are driving towards a greater purpose, that it's something that's bigger than the sum of the individual parts gathered within this room, and it's something that's worth fighting for. And it's this idea of creating something that's bigger than the sum of the parts gathered within this individual room that forms the basis of our event strategy for 2014. The conversation is continuing, but we're pivoting it slightly. Rather than focusing on you and me as the individual, we're now going to focus on how we grow together collectively as a community. And within that broad spectrum of topics, we picked entrepreneurship and innovation as the first cabs off the rank. Now, why did we do that? Well, the simplest way to think about it is to look at the facts. We live in Australia, one of as beautiful as it is expensive. Indeed, just a couple of weeks ago, Forbes rated Sydney quite comfortably one of the top 10 most expensive cities in the world to live in. I think we can all safely agree that providing masses of cheap labour isn't the way we're going to get ahead in Australia. On that point, we actually live in a world where the future of industry is being redefined by disruptive enterprises. We are, after all, in the age of innovation and digital startups. And if you needed further evidence, just think of the household names as in Apple, Google, Facebook, PayPal, Instagram, eBay, WhatsApp, Freelancer, Atlassian, all multi-billion-dollar companies, of which only one existed more than 15 years ago. But more specifically within the young professional Sikh community, where again it becomes relevant for us, there is just no way we're going to get ahead by harnessing our masses of labor. There just isn't enough of it. So our collective professional pursuit as a community must be that of the mind. It must be an intellectual pursuit. And the greatest way that we're going to fulfill this, and the greatest way we're going to make an impact, is by innovating. And it's innovating within our businesses and organizations, and it's innovating to create new businesses and organizations. And if we are to create something great from this first generation, then this is the path that we must pursue. So that's the reason we picked tonight's conversation. It hones in precisely on that central idea which we believe will propel this community together to being successful. So where does that leave us? We know that we're in this together, that we must create a new conversation, that it must be intellectual, and in the professional context, the conversation for our community must be about creation and it must be about innovation. On a very personal front, this is a topic that's very close to my heart. I've spent the better part of 6 years working in management consulting, focused on strategy and innovation, and for the past 6 months, I've been trying my hand out at entrepreneurship. And if there's one thing I've learned from my time in these fields, it's that inherently new business is about disrupting or improving the status quo, thereby being one of the primary conduits towards progress. I believe that this is a virtuous mission. Now, how we go about it or what specifically we should do, unfortunately, I don't have the answers to those. Thankfully, we have a couple of guys in the room who are much smarter than I am, who are going to help us unwrap these very complex questions. So without further ado, it gives me a great pleasure to invite up to the stage Mr. Bo Lees and Mr. Kim Harris, and of course, our moderator, Gurvansh Bhatia. Please give them a round of applause.
Wherever you feel comfortable. Hi everybody, my name is Gurvansh, and I'd like to welcome you all to YSPN's first event of 2014. And once again, a round of applause for Karan for that great speech. So today we're here for this panel discussion around innovation and entrepreneurship. To my right, we have Bo Lees, and to my left, we have Kim Harris. And I'll just shoot it over to both of them, and for 30 seconds, just introduce yourselves to the crowd.
Yeah, Bo Lees. I actually used to work here at Deloitte, but before they built this beautiful facility called The Source. Was here for about 5 years. I did a Bachelor of Laws, started out at a company, joined a large management consulting firm, joined a university, and now I work for CSIRO, head of strategy for Australia's National Science Agency. So it's a lot about innovation in there somewhere.
Excellent. And to my right, we have Kim.
Okay, so Kim Harris. I suppose I've spent the best part of the last 10 to 12 years working either on my own startups, with other startups, in other startups, investing in them, writing about them, and so on. So I've actually recently I founded a company called PushStart, which did a range of different things, but had an early stage kind of seed funding program that's called an accelerator. And in October last year, we started another company called 2515, which is much more about building companies rather than just investing in them.
All right, excellent. So the format for the evening tonight is going to be me asking a couple of prepared questions, which I'll throw over to the both of you, and then we'll open it out to the audience and let them ask some questions and pick your brains for about half an hour, 40 minutes. And then after that, we welcome you all to stay back and talk to Bo. And unfortunately, Kim might have to run off a bit early, but if you can grab Kim for 2 seconds afterwards, good luck.
But otherwise, what I'll do is I've explained to the guys. I'm happy for them to share my email address with you. Like, I get emails all the time. If you have any questions or anything that we don't get to go through tonight, by all means, please just drop me an email.
Great. And also, it gives you an opportunity to talk amongst yourselves and introduce yourselves to people you don't know after the event. So, yeah, I'll grab the mic.
Hello. Yeah, I think that's better for the people in the back. All right. So the first question, which is for both of you, is how you define innovation and entrepreneurship, and do you think often in society those two words are interchanged?
All right. And Karan has inspired me to be philosophical. Then, if you're going to go right to that level, Bill Gates has a wonderful quote that innovation is the most underestimated force in the world today. There's just this silent, relentless force that's been propelling us as a human race for 80,000 years. And you know, the twin inventions of capitalism and scientific discovery have really just had that shot up since 1750. You know, I think it is one of those fundamental human qualities that makes us human. Innovation is also a national economic concept that sort of, you know, is a big driver of productivity and economic growth. And it's also a business capability, a competency that every organisation needs to think about in terms of process, systems and people, what many of you in this room would think of when you think about marketing or IT or HR. But innovation is this very important business capability as well. The practice of it is what I think of as entrepreneurship or intrapreneurship. And entrepreneurs do that you know, in the service of an idea of a company on their own, and that's a hard journey. And I started out there in my career. I'm doing it again now with a startup called Intersective in the education technology space. But the intrapreneurship one is the more complex, doing that, I think, within that boundary of the large firm, and it's two very interesting concepts.
So intrapreneurship, do you want to
explain
a bit?
Gifford Pinchot wrote a book called Intrapreneurship in 1983, and he sort of said that the corporation is designed to kill ideas, and the entrepreneur is someone who will try and generate new ideas that create value within the boundary of the firm, and will do that over and over again and will persevere. And so there's a lot of qualities, I think, that an intrapreneur and entrepreneur share, but I think they're both practitioners of the discipline of innovation.
Right, excellent. I think we'll come back to that a bit later, but Kim,
Yeah.
do you want to hear the question again?
No, I just want to qualify by prepared questions. I mean, they were prepared, not I was prepared.
Yeah.
But actually, no, can you hear me up the back? Yeah. Better with the mic, so my voice is a bit funny. Yeah, so obviously, like, both smashed it, right? That was an awesome explanation of what it is, particularly around innovation. I think is well placed to speak. But around entrepreneurship, it's I've actually got cousins from France, and they were out recently, and I was asking them, like, what's that actual verb in French? Entrepreneur. What does it actually mean? It's not a noun; it's a verb. And what it means is for them to dare to take a risk, right? And so I think there's a real element of that. It's not about entrepreneurship. Is, you know, in Australia we go, oh, it's the reallocation of resources, blah 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 blah. Like if you go back all the way to the roots, it's to dare to do something where there's a lot of risk, and that's what entrepreneurs, especially in the tech space, are actually doing. There's masses of uncertainty in this type of innovation, and it's kind of a daring pursuit to try and figure out if you can build something of value through that.
On that point, no, well, it's kind of moving on to the next question. So, what is it about entrepreneurship and innovation that appealed to you? So, what made you take that risk?
I suppose, like, for me, I've kind of got I suppose, a curious nature, and a curious nature that kind of moves into action of some sort. So it was, like, I came out of uni, I've got a law degree, I did a Master's of Commerce, I actually did a sports management degree. I wanted to be Jerry Maguire. That was my first degree. And then beyond that realised that was not actually going to happen. And then I worked for big companies, worked for the government, did a bunch of things, and just for me personally, it was much more interesting to be able to pursue things that I was curious about, and then to try and, if you're going to do those things and you're going to do them full time, then it means you have to take some sort of commercial approach to them. And so that's kind of where my interest came from.
There's probably a clever answer in here somewhere, but I honestly, for me, it's just something I can't not do. Mm-hmm. You know, whatever context I found myself in, whether it's a large business or whether it's you know, just thinking about, you know, something that would be cool to start up. It's just I want to create things. That's just something I'm passionate about. I was a management consultant for about 6 years, so I try and look at things as a discipline of creating things as well, and break them down into how you do that at larger scale, and that's something I've learned to do. But fundamentally, I really like changing things. I like sort of that process of progress, I think you called it, Karen, and really being part of that, whether, you know, you're the direct catalyst of it or whether you're creating the conditions to enable it and to allow it to happen. And that's just something that I'm hugely passionate about. It's just the single thing at the heart of my career.
So do you think it's a characteristic amongst certain people, or?
I think it's a characteristic. Sort of, you go to the Edison quote of it's 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. I think anybody can be part of the innovation journey, of the innovation value chain, can involve themselves in innovation and contribute to it. For me, it's just something I've been personally passionate about. But I think certain people are drawn to that. You know, changing the status quo, relentless progress, that focus on the future, learning new stuff. Kim used the word curious, and I think that's a big part of it too.
Alright, so the next question is around, I think, balancing the creativity versus, you know, reality and pragmatism. So how do you do that, especially within an industry, and then also when you are starting something by yourself, so when you're in the entrepreneurial space?
Yeah, so my first business, it was in early 2000s. It was a web aggregator of event services, and sort of that was an idea that I was pretty passionate about, you know, doing large events and bus tours and winery tours and pub crawls and all that. But there was some pragmatism that had to come in there, which was, you know, that became very evident that was a non-scalable business. The web wasn't there yet, and I ended up sort of, you know, doing too much in the events themselves, and then, you know, doing events with my friends, and that sort of sucked up all the profit. So I think Kim talked about it. You really need to have an eye to where's the commercial value that you are creating, definitely. And you know, when you think of executing new ideas to create value, what I would just say is that a definition of innovation. Certainly part of that value needs to be commercial. So you've got to be pragmatic. Who's going to pay? Even if you are developing an idea that's going to save the world and is in the not-for-profit sector, it's got to be not for loss as well. So how are you actually going to resource the commitment that you love to make and resource the impact that you want to have in the world? And that's really critical.
The question is, how do you balance being a visionary and creativity against, you know, reality and pragmatism?
Yeah, so I suppose it's that's a real challenge for me, even because, like, everyone will tell me their ideas tonight, and I'm like, oh, that sounds awesome, you know, that's the best. And I'm like, oh, it's kind of a bad trait to have for someone who might be investing in companies. But over time, what's happened is through personal experience, I suppose you develop these processes, these kind of frameworks of thinking about things, which really are, listen, that sounds like a great idea, but then you kind of pull it back and go, hold on, what's the problem? How do you solve it? Yeah, it looks really good. I think it makes sense, but let's actually go test some of these ideas. And some things like, it's interesting, over the years, things like lean startup methodology have come around, and it's generally applicable. It's not always like it's not the only path, but it's a good process for just pulling everything back and saying, hold on, what are the things I know? What don't I know? What things do I have to test? How's that going to actually define things before I spend too much money on the process? And so just through experience and then new tools that come out through, for example, like lean startup methodology, it's kind of, that's how, like personally, I balance this thing where I think, oh yeah, that sounds awesome as an idea.
Can I quickly explain lean startup?
I saw heads nodding, so who knows about lean startup methodology? Okay, there's a few hands. They weren't very high, so I couldn't see them. But effectively, it's kind of this build, measure, learn cycle. And what the idea of lean startup methodology is, it's actually a rip-off of Lean Six Sigma, right? So it's not, again, a lot of people think we invent stuff in the startup space. We often borrow things and kind of repurpose them. And really, it's just this process where what you're trying to do is try to find out as much as you can and build your product based on direct inputs that you've actually kind of measured from the field. You take a scientific approach to the development of products and services. Kind of even going back before lean startup methodology, there was a guy, Steve Blank, who wrote a book called 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And those 4 steps were very similar to lean startup methodology. But really, the basic premise is get out of the building, start talking to people, find out what their customers want. And it worked really well because there was a shift at the same time in the market in terms of the cost of actually starting up a technology business. So back in even up to kind of the late 90s, where all these VCs were chucking tens of millions of dollars into products, it's because all of this infrastructure didn't exist and you had to build your own proprietary infrastructure to create a company. And then throughout the 2000s, all this open infrastructure, so things like Amazon Web Services or free kind of blogging tools, or if you want to log into something, you can just borrow Facebook's authentication. All these things mean that it's practically free to actually start an online or a technology business in most cases. And what that means is that the risk is not technology risk, it's market risk. And the way you address that is as early as possible going out, understanding what's happening, having a set of hypotheses that you want to test, things that you're unsure of, things that you think might be accurate, that, the YSPN, like going to consulting companies, and having events there, that's a hypothesis, let's go and test it. And you take that scientific approach to actually going out and testing your hypotheses, and through that process you create products and services that ideally people actually want, rather than going through the process of building it and hoping that people will come later. That was a really convoluted version. There's heaps of stuff online. Check it out. Lean startup methodology.
It's actually what we used to come up with the YSPN idea.
Okay, cool.
CQ's Australia holds a leadership program once every year, and as part of that, in the not-for-profit stage, they use the lean startup canvas to kind of, methodology to come up with the ideas. So if you want to learn more, go to the weekend. All right, I'll just use this to ask the next question, which is, so how did you make that leap from, I guess, the corporate space into the entrepreneurial space, and vice versa? So I know you did vice versa. But
yeah, I've done vice versa a couple of times. So when I was at university, I got involved in some startup competitions, etc. As part of university, as you do. And I think by the end of university, I was running a social club, let's call it, across all 4 universities in WA where I grew up. And I thought, let's turn this into a business and put the web element into it. And I was really passionate about starting a company straight out of university. And I did that for about 3 years. Made some positive failure mistakes, which I've learned from. Don't start a business that doesn't scale. But at a certain point, I won another competition, got some startup money for an idea that was actually really good and exists today. But sort of had a risk decision to make. Do I try and do that at 24, 25, and that maybe I would work on that for 4 years and it doesn't work out, or do I go get a real job? And so I went and got a job at university and in the tech commercialisation space actually, and learned a lot. Learned a lot about technology, learned a lot about large organisations, then moved into Deloitte and got really passionate about innovation in large businesses, innovation within the Deloitte network, but also working with companies like Woodside and Wesfarmers and some universities to set up their innovation frameworks. And that was fantastic. Then you know, at the same time that I moved to CSIRO to learn more about really hard core technology and science, again from the innovation aspect, you know, had this sort of idea and opportunity to spin an education, what has become an education technology company out of some activities that we were doing here at Deloitte. Got an idea, started as a services company, pivoted in lean startup talk several times, and is now a technology company which is trying to make work integrated learning cheaper and better.
And in all those areas, what did you find was your biggest challenge?
In all those areas?
Oh, well, pick one.
I think that the different paces that those different organisations work at and the different contexts of them has, you know, it takes a little while to sort of move out of, you know, if I spend, you know, take a week off and spend it working on the startup and then go back to the large government, you know, agency, there's a different pace of life and a different way of working, a different culture. And so I think you do have to change speeds mentally when you're doing that. Also, when I was moving out of my first startup, you know, I hadn't actually been in an organisation with large resources, with networks, and that took a little while to think of all the opportunities to tap those resources and networks and to be an entrepreneur. You know, there are huge benefits to that, to actually have the resources of a large firm to back your ideas, if the firm likes those ideas. But there's also a big political context to deal with as well. And so the different speeds, I think, and the different contexts are the biggest difference.
Kim? The question? The question is, how did you find the leap from, you know, corporate life and
like I did it slowly and then fast. So like a slow process, and then when I wasn't working on my own startups, I was doing stuff on the side, and then when we created Pushstart, went all in. But listen, like there's a lot of talk around the kind of startup or the entrepreneurship space that says, hold on, if you believe in something, you should just drop your job and do all this stuff. But the reality is this, that like often that's said by young people who don't have any commitments or who aren't risk averse or whatever. And there are lots of different ways that you can figure out if the entrepreneurial life is for you. And if it isn't, that's not bad. Do you know what I mean? It's just some things are good for some people and some aren't. One way you can test it is by doing things on the side. The only caveat there is that that you can't really think of it as something on the side. It then becomes your second job. So you can't do like 1 or 5 hours a week or whatever. Speed of execution in startups matters, right? You're racing to try to get something that the market wants before you either get bored or run out of money or do whatever. So if you want to do it on the side, just realise that you're going to be really, really busy, because you're going to have your one job, which is daytime hours, and the other one, which is nighttime hours. The other is, and we're getting a bit luckier now, where in Australia we're getting we're getting some larger Australian startups, mid-size and then beyond, but we're also getting a lot of US companies coming down to Australia. And there's massive learnings to be had by actually working inside a technology business that's come out of a startup. So, not that there's anything wrong with a Microsoft or whatever, but Microsoft is a completely different beast to just say Airbnb in Australia. They're both, you know, Airbnb is worth billions of dollars, but still operates like a startup. You see how they shift between the resources they have and so on. So, yeah, you can do it on the side. You can make the leap completely if you're able to, or you can go work inside a startup and figure out how that all works. But me, what I did was I did a lot of stuff on the side, was very, very busy for a long time, and then when the time was right, I moved down to a 9-to-5 job and focused purely on startups.
Right, I'll ask one more question and we'll open it up to the audience. And this was kind of more practical one, which is what are the realities of actually working in the startup space, or some of the realities?
Kim just said it really well. Bloody hard work. I think the reality is, I reflect on two experiences. The first one, I was a sole entrepreneur and doing it full time. It was actually my job to make a living. And at that point, I was young and had no commitments. And at this point, my second experience is I'm doing it on the side, disciplined weekend, couple of nights a week. And my wife has definitely sort of set a threshold for how much work I can do, and I'm not leaving my 9-to-5 job just at the moment. I think it just really does come down to perseverance and resilience and hard work. It is so difficult when you're running a startup and you love it and you're putting everything into it to get that first rejection, second rejection, third rejection, fourth rejection. You talk to dozens and dozens of customers that might not want to deal with you, and it's the 15th or the 20th or the 30th that actually will help you out and give you that break. And I think that resilience to just keep going, but also the humility to take on board the advice and feedback the market is giving you, and realise that maybe your first idea or your second idea or your third idea wasn't quite it, and in Lean Startup Talk, pivot, and really accept that and accept, okay, I'm going to go in this direction now and try that, and to reduce the cycle time of that, and learn to listen to those signals faster, and do that faster. I think 3 really key things.
So yeah, I'll reiterate, like, it's really, really hard, right? I know I'm supposed to be turning people on, but I just want to set the expectation up. And more than the vast majority, almost every single person who starts a startup, is that business will go nowhere, right? So there are a couple of rules, right? So you want to make sure that at least if you're working on something you're passionate about or you actually care about, it makes that process a lot easier, or something that you actually want to learn about. So at least the outcome of that, even if the business goes nowhere, that there's been an educational process. But yeah, like, it's really, really hard. And exactly like Bo said, like inside of a corporate, what you have is this certainty of kind of resource availability and this certainty of outcome, and someone will get back to you. And if you're working at a big company, you're probably more important than your company is probably more important than the company you're talking to. So people want to chat to you. It works the other way, where you have these kind of ebbs and flows of, like, one week no one will get back to you, and you're like, why is no one calling? Like, what happened? Like, they all hate me suddenly. And then the next week on Monday, everyone's like, oh, sorry, I was out of the country. And you're like, yes. And then on Tuesday, you write back to them and you don't hear from a week. And you're like, oh no. So it's just this constant up and down. If you don't actually care about what you're doing, or you're not really interested in whatever business you're trying to create, it's going to be super hard.
Just add one thing to that. I think the upside of that, and I agree completely with what you're saying about the ebbs and flows and the emotional highs and the emotional lows, but the highs are really high. When you win and you created it, and you've persevered and your idea was right, wow, there's nothing better than that. There's nothing better than that validation. So I think that's the upside.
Excellent, thank you. We'll open it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions for these two?
Yeah, but a question about working at the CSIRO.
Stand up.
Stand up. Just with working at the CSIRO, you're working now with scientists, all these people that actually know a lot about the world that we work in, and they analyse it and go through it properly. How does it feel relative to working with people in business? Don't take that the wrong way. Working in business.
I was fortunate enough that I'd worked at a university before I worked at Deloitte, and then when I was at Deloitte, I worked with a lot of universities. So to me personally, it wasn't that alien. But I think what I've learned from working closely with scientists and science leaders is they're really deep thinkers. I think in business, you can skate an inch wide and a mile inch deep and a mile wide. Yeah, that's right. A lot of the time, I think in business, just like science, you need expertise, but the relativities are different. So CSIRO is actually an applied research agency. We don't do science for science's sake. We do science to make a difference in the world, to have a positive impact, whether that's economic, environmental, or social. So we build technologies and get companies to deploy them. And increasingly, we have to take scientists, those deep thinkers, and put that T-shaped team around them, and there's some phenomenal applied scientists who can go broad and multidisciplinary and integrate different teams of economists and social scientists and material scientists and hydrogeologists to solve a real world problem. And that's why I love the CSIRO. I don't think I could work in a pure science institute per se, where you're sort of just dedicated to one niche problem, but that multidisciplinary science, and I increasingly see business go here. You're looking at teams in business drawing on different capabilities. You see businesses drawing in entrepreneurs more and more, different mindsets. And I really love working with businesses. CSIRO works a lot with GE, Boeing, Bayer, these really big businesses and very small companies as well, and seeing that collaboration between business and research. Research and business collaboration is a huge thing. We're the 5th lowest in the OECD for rates of research and business collaboration, and it's a massive driver of productivity, and I'd love to see more of it, and that's why I'm actually there.
There's another question on the back of that. Pretty much, in terms of when you talk about Australia not really investing in the research that we should, like, we're 5th or something, you say, in terms of the amount of money that we invest. I didn't
13th in.
Well, that goes to show about business people. What kind of regulation are you actually seeing within Australia? What kind of legislation are you seeing to support research that's going to change our world in the future? Like, that's really important to all of us here, and it also gives someone working in a particular industry an eye into what may be important for investing in the future.
Yeah, I think we're 13th in the world at investment into R&D as a proportion of GDP, so we're right up there. But the government invests 9.3 billion per annum last year in R&D. I don't think I'm being at all controversial by saying I'd love to see more invested in basic science. There are some really long-term, forward-thinking funding programs that both governments over the years have supported. I'd love to see us up more near 3% of GDP invested into basic science. I think we're at 2.2 or something of that nature. So I'd love to see more of it. Where we can really improve, and the rate of research and business collaboration is part of this. So we for a country of about 2% of the world's population, we have about 3.5% of scientific publications, but only 0.3% of patents. We're dead last in the OECD for international investment into research, from offshore coming into Australia. I think this, and Kim will talk about this far more deeply than I can, but there's something really awesome happening in early stage startups in Australia. But we have this density problem of capital and distance to markets and small markets. So I think it's actually the flows, the collaboration, the doing more with the great research that we do here in Australia and connecting it more into business, because the distance from the lab to the market is getting a lot smaller. And that's a really big realisation that I've had over the last 5 years. For industries that didn't really need to think hard about science 5 years ago, you do now. And that includes the services industries. You're seeing all this automation of knowledge kind of coming out of the lab, and pretty soon it's actually being deployed into analytics that are replacing professional servants. So.
Just on that point, distance to market, Kim, I'm going to ask you here. Do you want to explain that a little bit more?
But no, typically, like, there's this tyranny of distance in Australia where we're so far from large markets around the world, even though people try to tell us we're in this Asian century and we're in the same time zone. Like, I just came back this morning, so that's why I'm a bit yawning a bit, from Japan. So that's a 10-hour flight. Do you know what I mean? That's not close. They're similar time zone, but like, I know that Japan's not the most southern part of Southeast Asia, but still. So there was this problem. The reality is, though, at least for internet companies, it's twofold. If you're doing business over the internet, then what the internet is really this global marketing and distribution engine, particularly for digital goods. And so it reduces that problem of being so far away from large markets. The reality is, though, that business gets done between people, right? And so for all the young startups we see who go, I'm just going to pop over to the States and do whatever, they think, oh, I watch a lot of American TV, I think I understand American culture. It doesn't work like that. And so you really need to be embedded or have key people embedded in larger markets in order to be able to sell into those markets. So if you're focusing on those other markets, you really need to be over there. And the challenge is if you insist on keeping most of your people here, which is a completely valid decision, there have been some very large startups built and sold here. You just need to realise that the market, the total market size that you can kind of deeply hit because of your cultural understanding and the relationships you have is going to be much smaller than if you go to somewhere like the US or to Europe, or even the only caveat there is the US is not one market, Europe's not one market, Asia is not a country. Do you know what I mean? Like there are all these different markets, but there's a much better understanding over in those larger kind of groupings of markets of how to do business. So that's, in my mind, that's some good things about like the internet and what it's enabled for us, but it hasn't removed this fact that business is still hard to do from this far away from most of the large markets.
Perhaps a related question. It's around sort of the panel, around the culture around entrepreneurship, and you mentioned some other markets. What are the key differences you'd say between Australia versus the rest of the world, the Silicon Valleys or Asia, for example, in the networks and the establishment? Is it easy to get out there as an entrepreneur?
Okay, so the obvious one to talk about is Silicon Valley and now more and more San Francisco. Okay, so let's start by saying the people there aren't any smarter, right? Like all startup entrepreneurs I know, I say go over there just so you can like dispel this myth of it's this magical land of smart people. The ratio of good to bad people is just as large. Actually, we're probably kind of better represented here in Australia. It's just in sheer, absolute numbers, there are more kind of good people. But so the people aren't any smarter, but the difference is, one, there's this, particularly in the US, and understand that it's not just in Australia, every startup or kind of want-to-be startup centre across the world all points to Silicon Valley and says, we want to be the next Silicon Valley, and they all have the exact same issues. Culturally, there's not the risk appetite. This is what they point to. There's not the same amount of capital available, and there's just not a history of entrepreneurs who have actually been through the process. That's not something that's unique to us. It's something that's unique to everywhere outside of Silicon Valley, and it's part of the reason why Silicon Valley can't be replicated, because the roots of all that were created back in the 60s and so on. And so even if we did exactly what they did today, we're operating in a different environment. So, but the good news is that what you're starting to see more of in Sydney is pockets of entrepreneurial activity, and that's the one really good thing that happens when you go to areas like San Francisco. You start being amongst your people. So here, if you say, what am I doing on this tech startup? Oh, what does that mean? People don't really understand. The same way as if you said I'm a doctor, I'm an accountant, or I'm a consultant, whatever. In San Francisco, people know. And you talk about things, there's this language, a shared language of things that you can't necessarily talk to everyone about here. So that's kind of one of the really big differences. But apart from that, I'd say the biggest things are the risk appetite. So this kind of sense that it's okay to fail as long as you kind of learnt something from it. And the other is the access to capital. So perfect example. Who here knows a company called Y Combinator? Yeah, that's most of you. So it's a early stage funding program, and their two big hits were like Uber and Airbnb came out of there. And it's really interesting that the guy that runs that program said that Uber and Airbnb were two of the companies that had the hardest time raising follow-on money out of the actual program. And where you have a market where there's an abundance of capital, what happens is the ideas that seem bad still get funded. And within the startup space, there's an understanding that the ideas that go on to be, big companies are the ideas that seemed to be bad, but that were actually good, right? That's the difference. And normally they seem bad because they're ahead of the market, right? And you just need someone who can execute and until the market catches up. So in Australia, for instance, we have this real problem where we kind of look to overseas and try to understand what's happening and just copy what they're doing without context. And anything that looks like a bad idea, there's not enough capital, so even the bad ones don't get funded, and it's the bad ones that turn into the good ones, which mean that's part of the reason why we don't create these big companies. So abundance of capital and an appetite for risk and the experience makes a big difference over there. Everywhere else in the world, without fail. Don't worry about New York, you say, oh, that's a big tech hub, Austin, London, Berlin, Singapore, Sydney. Everybody is trying to chase that, and Silicon Valley is the only place where that specific culture exists.
I'll just add a very little bit. I think the other thing about Silicon Valley, and I really like Kim's story about telling people to go over there so they're not any smarter. And nowhere else also had trillions of dollars over decades of US military funding. So there's also that. There's a huge stack effect there that is very, very difficult for anywhere else to replicate. But Kim just rattled off the list of cities. Go have a look at the Startup Genome Report. Sydney and Melbourne are up there in terms of the vibrancy on a range of different measures of the entrepreneurial scene, and things like what Kim is doing with the incubators and with the accelerators. There's enough people, there's enough critical mass now. It's almost like starting a sputtering car, which has taken 20 years, but it might be starting, and it's really exciting.
Kind of inspired me to come up with a bad idea and go to Silicon Valley.
Preet?
Just a really quick question. Hindsight is a beautiful thing in all aspects of life, especially business or strategy or innovation. If you guys had a chance to speak to your younger selves when you were sitting in this audience, what's one thing that you wish you had heard or learnt when you were younger, and with the experience that you have now? It doesn't have to be too detailed.
Yeah.
Broad themes of this.
I've shared a little bit about sort of what I did straight out of university. I probably would have said go do the management consulting thing straight out of university and learn a bit about large business and de-risk your career rather than start the business. But I'm really glad I did start a business in my 20s. I think that I would have liked to do both. I probably would have reversed the order in hindsight. But I'm glad I did both of those things. And don't ever start a non-scalable business. If you can't see how this is going to grow and serve millions of customers, don't start it.
Yeah. For me, I think I'm not even a big Star Wars fan. I'm going to sound like a geek, but there's that Yoda thing where he goes, do or do not. There is no try. Do you know what I mean? Somewhere, who's the Star Wars geek in here? Put your hand up. He says something like that, doesn't he? Yeah, that's what I would have told myself. I tried, like when I was younger, like I tried a few ideas in a few different businesses, and like they were either like, I would have told myself, let's either do it and do it, like do it kind of with conviction, or don't do it. Yeah, there we go.
Both of you guys have talked about the importance of capital. And obviously, in the US and Silicon Valley and San Fran, there's a fair bit of capital going around. How do you see Australian startups being able to compete with that, or what sort of strategies can they actually adopt, considering abundance of capital is probably not something that these guys actually have?
Do you just want to repeat that?
The question was around abundance of capital overseas as compared to in Australia, and how startups can combat that, I guess. So I'll pass it to the...
Do you want to take that,
Kim?
Yeah. So the easy answer is you can't. Like we can't compete. It's that kind of simple. The good news is that capital is not as important at the early stage, and that if you get a business to if you start getting like traction, or you start getting real customers who seem to be engaged with your product or service, capital is not an issue. Do you know what I mean? So if you're a good company, capital is not an issue in Australia at all. If you're that bad company that might turn into the good one, that's a different issue. But the good thing is that it's so cheap to run a startup these days that you can bootstrap yourself. But I just want to remind everyone that raising money is not kind of the end. It's a means to an end, which is building a large company or building a company that gets acquired or whatever it is you want. And the reality is the more money you take, the larger the company is that you'll have to turn your little idea into in order to satisfy the investors who, without getting too kind of detailed, have particular rights to allow you to sell or not sell your company. So the more money you make, just times that by 10, the last valuation you raised at, and that's what your investor will expect you to sell for. So for instance, if you raise, just because I see some faces here, if you raise $2 million at a $10 million valuation, that investor is expecting that you're going to turn into a $100 million company. To get to a $100 million company, who was I talking to? Someone. We were having a chat about this. Your odds of getting to $100 million, kind of exiting for $100 million, drop off a cliff at about $100 million. The probability is minuscule compared to before then, and the time frame blows out to 7 to 10 years, right? So that's 7 to 10 years of what we were talking about, going as hard as you can, kind of ups and downs, and am I winning, am I not, raising money is a pain, then investors telling you what to do and all the rest. So money, taking lots of money isn't necessarily your friend. Case in point, WhatsApp, right? They did one round, $8 million from one company, and then they sold for $19 billion, right? That's an awesome outcome for the investors, for the entrepreneur, for everyone, right? So you don't actually need lots and lots of money to build a successful company. It certainly kind of greases the wheels, but if you've got a real business that people actually care about, you'll either be able to finance yourself through customers paying you, or if you need high growth, you'll definitely be able to find money here or abroad. And a perfect example, Atlassian, Big Commerce, two companies that raised $60 million each from abroad.
Right, just one more question, and then you can talk to the guys after. Over there, you had your hand up.
Hi guys. My question is, coming from a law background, I don't really have the technical skills to sort of build half my ideas. So what are some thoughts on validating your ideas to pick which one to actually follow through on when you can't build like your minimum viable product yourself?
Yeah, she's got the words.
I can speak as a law graduate, running a tech company, and working at a science agency. Don't limit yourself by anything. Don't put a label on yourself. I think if you're smart and you can apply the frameworks and systems that I think Kim was talking about earlier, you've got the lingo around lean startup. Find the right people who can fill in your skill sets. Engage with a lot of customers. Think about what you're bridging to the idea. I was talking to a lady at a startup event a couple of weeks ago, and she's got a really great idea around some K-12 education stuff. Build the PowerPoint that is the app or the system that you want to build. Go find a web developer who can maybe help you build a really early stage prototype that you can show somebody. Find people with those technical skill sets in your network. Go to one of Kim's meetups and talk to software engineers. But go find people who will complement your skill set. But don't think you can't do that because you're this. I think it's the best advice.
No, yeah, like so. It seems like you understand how lean startup methodology works, and so you'll know there's a lot of stuff you can validate before you even need to build something. It can be a piece of paper, it can be a PowerPoint slide. There are kind of drag and drop app makers for phones and websites, and all that stuff's for free. So you don't actually have to do a lot, but the only thing you need to realise, because there are a lot of business-focused people that get into tech startups, and I like to use analogies because it kind of gives you a different context. If I was, it's like saying I'm a restaurateur, I'm going to have the best restaurant, but like I can't cook. But obviously, at some point, you're going to have to go find a chef to actually cook the food, right? So understand that if you're talking about a technology business, at some point in time, technology actually needs to be developed, and so there's a lot of demand. If you're not capable or you're not willing to pay someone just to develop stuff, if you want someone to actually be part of your business and be like a technical co-founder, there's a lot of demand for technical people to be co-founders. Like the balance of power is very much in their favour at the moment. So the best thing you can do is get as much traction as possible, or show people that you have some evidence as to why they should take on the risk of working with you. So definitely go out, talk to customers, see these things, build it, and even learn the basics. It's so not hard. There are lots of online courses, whether it's just an HTML thing, like a front, pretty design, or you don't have to get too technical. It's not that hard to learn. And really, if this is the business that you're going to be in, again, a restaurateur probably has a very good idea of how they may not be an awesome chef, but they'll definitely understand how cooking works and how a kitchen runs. And so you need to understand the technical side. You can't just say, hold on, here's the demarcation between technical and business. You actually have to know that if you're going to run a technology business.
Yeah, quickly go.
Just one last question. Sorry, I was sort of going to ask something about that, but that's just following on. You were talking about to get into the mindset working for a tech startup.
Yeah.
And following on from that, a lot of professional services people over here, I guess law students or accounting students and all that, very different mindset working in a big company. What can we sort of bring to a tech startup where the real skill that's needed, like you said, is a technology thing? Where do we sort of come in, and are we just effed sort of thing because we can't bring anything, or can we actually bring something?
So there's is it going on and off?
Yeah.
I'll talk really loud. There's actually this moment where they talk about startups and scale-ups, right? And startups, you need particular skills, which is this kind of really rapid iteration and to be able to do things. Scale-ups are where processes and resources matter, right? And if you've got someone who's been an entrepreneur all their life or who's never worked at a company of any real size, they won't understand how to build those processes and those kind of and how to allocate those resources in a way that a company that starts to get larger is going to need. So the reality is that you may, unless you have a particular passion for an area, you may struggle to get a job inside, like a paying job inside a small startup. But a mid-sized startup, they need things that big companies have, and they probably are looking for people that have experience in working in big companies and understanding how to set things up to be more efficient in the way they do things. So you do have a lot of skills. It's just today, where if that's the kind of growth, that's the growth side of a startup. Down here, all the skills that you're learning inside a corporate probably don't apply down here. They just don't, right? Doesn't mean you can't learn them, but today, if all you've got is corporate experience, that's probably not going to help too much down here. But as the startup starts to grow, but fortunately, if you're actually looking for a job, that's when that startup's going to be able to afford to pay you. So you don't want to work for a startup that's too small unless.
Just very quickly, I agree with most of what Kim said there. I think right from the start, the processes and systems, the documentation, really building that into the DNA of your startup is hugely important. Ex-professional services person, again, doing a startup. I think as well, if it's a B2B idea, if you understand how large business works, that's a really important customer-facing attribute that you can bring. If you're starting a B2C idea, which is going on the App Store and you want to get consumed, 14-year-old kids to buy it, maybe not quite as relevant right at the start. But if your idea is about creating value in a large business context and you understand the buying process, and you can bring some of those skills to that buying process and the language and understand tendering and all of that kind of good stuff that we know and love, that's really important.
All right, great. Well, that concludes the formal part of the evening. Thank you.
So I'll just conclude two things. One, email address Kim, K-I-M, @pushstart.com.au, because I'm about to run out the door. The second thing is this, help each other out, right? This is awesome, what you guys have actually built here. And how long have you been going for?
A year and a half.
A year and a half. This is more people than we get in a room, for the first few years of the tech startup meetups that I was running, right? And now we've got 3,000 members, right? And what builds kind of how you get value out of this is how much you interact with each other, how much you can call upon each other. People are working across different industries. You may have some technical people, you may have some pure business people or lawyers if you're talking about terms for financing. Help each other out, but this is you may think, we've got a room full of people and it's all, dude, this is awesome. Honestly, these guys should be congratulated for pulling this all together.
Thanks very much for that, Kim. Just everyone, if you could give a round of applause to both Bo and Kim. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sure I can talk it's been very insightful to hear the thoughts on innovation and entrepreneurship. And just want to pass back to Karen, who will just close it up for the night.
And thanks as well to our moderator, Gurvanch. Great job. Thanks for that. Thanks for that. I won't take up too much of your time, but obviously that was a real privilege to listen to that. Thanks for the plug for YSPN. Really appreciate it. And both thanks for the management consulting career advice. I know we're going to pass this on to Deloitte, so we'll get this facility forever now. If you want a job, just talk to Ungit at the back there. He's a loyal green dotter. Just a couple of things that I picked on. I mean, there's a wealth of knowledge there, which I know I can relate in the last few weeks. What I mentioned in that opening address that I've been trying out my hand at entrepreneurship, and the point you raised about highs and lows, you sort of compare it to the client world, where a lot of you would be working client-facing in large corporations, and you get an email from a client and you're sort of depressed, saying he's riding my back, or I've got to deal with this annoying client. Whereas when you're in the startup world and you get one response from a client, and in your little office, your little meeting room, you're jumping around, high-fiving each other, and you're wondering, what did the client say? Oh, I just said email acknowledged. And on the other side, you don't hear an email. You don't hear from a client for 3 days, and you're sort of thinking of bankruptcy terms and how are we going to find another job. So you really ride those highs and lows. The other thing, that on a more serious note, I think Gurvanch touched on this, but the lean startup methodology that you spoke about in detail, Kim, is a fantastic thing, and it's the thing that incubated YSPN at the Seek Youth Australia Leadership Camp. So shameless plug for our steering committee and our sponsors, but if you guys want to immerse yourself in lean startup in a non-confrontational environment and have something good come out of it, like a community initiative like this, it's something really worth getting along to. Before you guys go, I know you've got to run off, Kim, we'd like to give you a small token of our appreciation, presented by one of our innovators and aspiring entrepreneurs on the YSPN team. So guys, if you could give them both, I know we've applauded a bit, but I don't think it's enough. So give Kim a round of applause, please. And of course the bow as well, a round of applause too. Thank you very much. So just two very quick things before we go. We can't leave tonight without thanking our sponsors and supporters. Of course, I've already mentioned Seek Youth Australia, and they're an invaluable supporter to us from before we started, for a lot of the members of the team since we've been kids. Of course, we have to thank Montagio Custom Tailoring. I'm wearing their merchandise now, and again, shamelessly plugging this. I've had a few suits tailored, and this is the best one I've ever owned. I should start getting paid for this. And of course Deloitte Australia, who have very graciously offered us this wonderful innovation room. If you go wander around, actually all the walls here are whiteboards, so it literally is where we do our innovation. We sit here and we sit on the sofas and we draw on the walls. There is food. We have this facility for another hour, so please stick around, please network, please get to know each other, and thank you all very much for coming out tonight.